Good. The microphone is already working. That's good. Now we just have to turn on our brains for an exciting panel discussion, which we are having now after lunch. My name is Hans Friederich. I'm a competition economist here from ECA in Berlin, also research fellow from the ESMT, and formerly have been also with the European Commission there as an enforcer. And I have the pleasure to zoom together with you and the panel a little bit deeper into the point of competition policy enforcement and consumer policy enforcement in the context of AI. So we are going a little bit from the big picture, which we had earlier this morning, to a very specific, but as I think, very important point. When I started at the Commission in 2003, that was a time where we had the big Microsoft cases. It was about Windows and tying and bundling with the Office programs. We were moving to browsers. We were moving to general search and social networks. We were also then later moving into the digital ecosystems. And now we are staying here at a point of time where we are looking back on this kind of antitrust enforcement on the digital economy, where some are having the feeling we did not such a good job in the past. WhatsApp, Google, DoubleClick were considered mergers which should not have happened. We are seeing a very high level of concentration in the digital economy. We have new systems established, DMA, DSA, and others. But still, is it working? And now we are lucky, because suddenly there is a disruptive innovation. AI is coming. Now we are starting from scratch. Google is shaking, everyone is nervous. Apple is doing suddenly cooperations with OpenAI, last mile. So now we can do everything better. And to come to a conclusion whether this kind of assessment is wrong or right, I'm sitting here together with an exciting panel. Actually, we ordered ourselves. The guys on the right, they are thinking it's sufficient enforcement. The guys on the left saying it's too little. No, this is not how is it going. Let me briefly introduce. It's right? You think you're sitting on the right corner? Somebody wants to change the places? No. So on the very right sits Oren Bar-Gil. He's a professor of law and economics from Harvard Law School. Before he was at the New York University School of Law. And interestingly, he got all of his education in Israel and as an economist. So you were a fully trained economist, and now you were at the law school.
I went to the US to get my legal training.
That's strange. That's strange. Normally we do it the other way around. You get in Germany you get the legal training, and then you go to the US to do good economics. In any case, you are doing good stuff, both on law and economics, I think. So we are excited to have you here on the panel. To the very left, I have Emilio Calvano. He's a professor of economics at the University of Rome. He's also associated faculty of the Toulouse University, and I understand you are really an economist grown and bred there in Toulouse, so a really strong micro-theorist, having worked with the best in this field. So this is exciting. It's even more exciting because you have published many of the seminal papers about algorithmic pricing, which will be a point which we will discuss in a second. Next is Moritz on the right, Moritz Hart. He's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Intelligent Systems in Tübingen and has been before an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And yeah, and actually you are a computer scientist. That's a strange animal. You're speaking with machines more than with humans? Is that what you're doing?
Probably, yeah.
Oh, okay. It's exciting to have you on the panel.
Thanks for having me here. Entertainment value.
No, he has prepared a very interesting impulse talk, I can tell you, and let's wait for that in a second. And then Joanna Bryson, she thinks she should sit on every panel. And she deserves it. She deserves it. I heard your introduction.
I wanted to stay in the moral philosophy meeting I was in yesterday. They insisted I come.
No, it's wonderful, wonderful to have you. And let me say, Heike Schweizer was originally planned to sit on this panel. So it's really a great loss to have lost this great thinker. I mean, she was a lawyer, but she was always in a creative application of law, and she was somebody who always made sure that the law is also grounded in good economics, and that I found really fascinating about her work. So it's a tremendous loss, I think, for the antitrust law enforcement community. So, but in any case, it gives us a pleasure to have you also on our panel. Pardon? Another computer scientist. Yeah, but you also have studied psychology, so I'm less scared about you than about Moritz, you know? Yeah. No, but with this kind of sorry, Moritz. With this introduction, let us directly dive into the substance. As the panel before with Hannes, everyone will give a little bit of an impulse talk. As a starter, Oren will start, Emilio will come next. We will, as a program, work a little bit specific, or the two of you will specifically focus on the application of AI-based models on consumer markets. So I think we should directly start, and Oren, the floor is yours. Oh, the microphone is even working.
Okay, can you hear me? All right, great. So this is the first talk that I've given in over 10 years without slides. And the reason that is happening is because Hannes told Hans that we're not supposed to have slides. So we were, as you can imagine, surprised that in Hannes's panel in the morning, everybody had slides. So we're trying to think what is the competitive or anti-competitive effects that are going on here. Maybe exclusionary or something. Anyway. All right, so what I want to talk about today briefly is about different harms or different categories of harms that can be caused in consumer markets when the decision makers are AI or AI-powered algorithms. And in order to kind of talk about these kind of different categories of harms, I want to start by distinguishing between different types of outcomes or strategies in consumer markets. Okay, so my first distinction, or the first distinction that I want to make, is between markets where we have more differentiation and markets where we have less differentiation. Okay, so you can imagine a market where the same product or service, the same pricing and so forth is targeted or offered to everyone. Or you can imagine a market where different products are offered to different people, or maybe the same product or service is offered to different people but at different prices. Okay, so this is the question of differentiation. Now, the question of differentiation is not a new question in economics. Okay? It is not invented by AI, but I also want you now to imagine kind of the jump in at least the quality or not the quantity of discrimination or differentiation that we can have when AIs are assisting in the decision-making process. Okay? So I want to imagine that you have an AI who is fed data about the long history of purchases that each one in this room has made, maybe also including the type of offers that each one of us has rejected over the past several years. Okay, this AI is going to have a lot of information that would be fed into and affect the different pricing and targeting decisions that the seller or service provider employing this AI is going to be making. Okay, so this is the first level of kind of the distinction that I want to make between markets with less differentiation. I sometimes might call them kind of the pre-algorithmic world or the pre-AI world, and markets with more differentiation. Again, this is not to say that there was no differentiation before AI, it's just that we have potentially much more now. The second distinction that I want to make, which will be kind of critical for the analysis that I will offer about consumer harms, is the distinction about the type of consumers who are populating any particular market. Okay, and a very kind of high level and very rough distinction that I want to make is between markets that are populated mainly by sophisticated consumers, okay, and markets that have many unsophisticated consumers in them. And what I mean by unsophisticated consumers is consumers that suffer from these kind of information and rationality deficits. Now, again, obviously, this is not a binary. There's a continuum. Okay, and some markets have more sophisticated players or consumers. Some have less sophisticated consumers or a larger number of less sophisticated consumers. Another thing that kind of cuts across is the level of complexity of the product or service that is being offered. Okay, when we have a very complex product or service, think about a mortgage that you're buying, okay, then even consumers who are relatively sophisticated might make mistakes. If you have a simpler set of products or services, like say you're buying a carton of milk in kind of your supermarket, then we don't need a lot of sophistication. Okay, but the point, the key distinction here is between markets with we have more consumers who are making largely informed rational decisions in markets where we have many consumers who are not making informed rational decisions. Now, with these distinctions in mind, I want to start with the first category of harm, and that is what I'll call kind of algorithmic price discrimination. Now, price discrimination is something, again, that is very kind of old news in economics. Okay, and so economists talk about different types of price discrimination. What I want to suggest to you is that these algorithms, with all the information that they have, all the data that they have on our history of purchases, what we were willing to buy and how much we were willing to pay for these particular products and services, can bring us much closer to the economists' ideal of a first-degree price discrimination. So basically the idea is if there is like a, imagine a demand curve. Okay, what the algorithm can do, this pricing algorithm, basically march down the demand curve and identify more or less the willingness to pay of every individual and set a price, okay, a different price for each one of these individuals. And, we're coming close to this reality in many contexts. The question now is whether this is good or bad. Okay, so, Hans said we're going to talk about kind of efficiencies in addition to potential problems. Let me just start with kind of the efficiency. Okay, in many situations where you can price discriminate in this way, it's a good thing. Okay, if you ask the kind of a traditional neoclassical economist, they will say that, first-degree price discrimination is good, okay, or at least largely good. Okay, it's efficient. If you're comparing it to a monopolist with a single price, you don't get deadweight loss. And beyond that, you can get differences in prices which we would find normatively appealing. Okay, so for example, if, say, Hans is richer than me, and because he's richer than me, he's willing to pay more for the same product than I am, I think it's fine that he will actually be paying a higher price and I'll be paying a lower price. Distributionally, that would be, a good thing. Generalizing. Under a neoclassical model, if we think that the willingness to pay of consumers is largely made up of some combination of preferences and, say, budget constraints, how much money we have, okay, then an algorithm that allows us to come closer to first-degree price discrimination can actually be a good thing. Okay? There are a bunch of caveats in the margin, which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A, but largely it's a good thing. Now compare this with a market where the consumers are not sophisticated, but rather are less sophisticated. This means that the willingness to pay that makes up this demand curve is not just a function of preferences and budget constraints, but it has a third component which can be really substantial and important, and that is a component I'll call it misperceptions. Okay, so imagine now that there are a bunch of consumers who overestimate the benefit from a certain product. Okay, imagine a treadmill, and I, as a consumer, I'm optimistic about how often I'm going to use that treadmill, okay, and so I attribute a high benefit, okay, and therefore I'm willing to pay a high price for it. Now, if the algorithm can identify my willingness to pay, and this willingness to pay has a big overestimation component, then I'll end up paying much more than I should for this treadmill and maybe a bunch of other products and services as well. Okay? What we see now is in these markets, this kind of approximation of first-degree price discrimination, okay, or getting close to that first-degree price discrimination becomes much more harmful and problematic for consumers. Consumers are going to end up paying much more than they should for a bunch of products, and this is something that maybe regulators should be worried about. So this is the first type of categories of harm when we have AI-powered algorithms setting prices. Implication of algorithmic pricing, algorithmic price discrimination. The second category of harm that I want to kind of briefly mention has to do with algorithmic targeting. Again, if we think about a neoclassical market where most consumers are informed and rational, okay, if we have an algorithm that sends product and service offers to me, and these offers are different from those that are sent, again, taking Hans here as the target, okay, that might be great, okay, because maybe our preferences are different, maybe our ability to pay is different, okay? If I get different offers and different products than he does, that is generally a good thing. In fact, and from an economics perspective, it saves me a lot of search costs. I don't need to find the product that's right for me. The algorithm knows me, okay, and sends immediately to me the offers that are good for me. Okay, now again, compare this kind of rosy picture, okay, to algorithmic targeting in a world where many consumers suffer from these rationality and information deficits. Okay? What will happen, or what might happen, not always, okay, but what might happen is that in a pre-algorithmic world, without differentiation, okay, maybe the seller will offer the same high-quality product to everyone, to all consumers, just because the seller doesn't have the ability to differentiate. But when we move to this algorithmic world where the seller and its algorithm has a lot of information that allows it to differentiate, we might get a situation where the less sophisticated consumers in this market are offered a lower quality product, objectively lower quality, but one that is overestimated. And the quality is overestimated, or the benefit is overestimated by this group of less sophisticated consumers who suffer from these information rationality deficits. Okay? And so for this group of consumers, the switch from no differentiation, the pre-algorithmic world, to yes differentiation, okay, harms them, and potentially significantly so. That was the second category of harm. In the third category or type of harms, I want to move from the assumption that implicitly guided me thus far, and that is basically that consumers already come pre-packaged with a set of information rationality deficits, biases, misperceptions, so forth. And the algorithm just knows to identify these and take advantage of them. I want to move from that assumption to an assumption where the algorithm can actually create or exacerbate, okay, the misperceptions that consumers suffer from. Okay, let me give you a few examples. So how many of you have heard of Ashley Madison? Okay, not enough. Or maybe enough, I don't know. It depends on your normative stance. So Ashley Madison is a dating website. The logo on Ashley Madison, or at least it was, is "Life is short, have an affair." Okay, so why am I mentioning this here? Okay, so there was a big scandal in the Ashley Madison world. Okay, it started when when the Ashley Madison database was hacked. And that was very bad for, as you can imagine, many people, and some tragic outcomes followed. But what I want to focus on is the information.
Don't give again an example to my.
No. If you insist. All right. Okay. There you go. So one of the things that came out from the data leak in the Ashley Madison case was how they were communicating with their clients. Okay, and it turns out, and I do not know this from personal experience, it turns out that when, usually these were guys, they went on the website and they started to chat with potential partners for these affairs. Now, the guys were believing that they were chatting with actual women on the website. Turns out they were chatting with, and this is kind of a quote from their materials, with fembots, okay? With bots that impersonated a potential partner. Okay? Now, this is just an example. By the way, these chatbots that were used by Ashley Madison were pretty kind of low quality. But you can imagine how things, evolve now with deep fakes and with kind of more sophisticated LLMs, both on kind of the language aspect of chatting, and then more, maybe even more profoundly if you have these deep fakes that pretend to communicate, pretend to be a human being when in fact they are not. the effects in consumer markets can be significant. If you think, for example, of pretending to be a celebrity influencer and causing consumers to buy things in that way when, in fact, otherwise they would not. Perhaps kind of more generally, think about advertising and advertising that is powered by algorithms. Okay, so now we might think that a lot of the content, okay, both in terms of kind of the text that is conveyed and communicated to consumers, maybe going beyond text as well, is driven by algorithms who know us and know what kind of phrasing and wording and pictures and videos will have an effect on me and might be different from those that might have an effect on, say, Tommaso, since I can't use Hans for these examples. Okay. All right, so this is another type of harm. Notice that I've not mentioned one of the at least most prominent, at least in the legal policy normative literatures that I know of in algorithmic decision making. What I have not mentioned is algorithmic discrimination based on race and sex. This is not because I think it is not important. On the contrary. But this is not the focus of my comments today. I just want to mention just a couple of things. It is not entirely obvious, if people are interested, I'm happy to talk about this, that the move from human-based decision-making to algorithmic-based decision-making is going to make this particular problem worse. It might, under certain circumstances, but not necessarily. Another important category of harm, but one which again I will not talk about, has to do with how algorithms can increase market power and coordination, because we have the foremost authority, Emilio, and he will be talking about that. So let me just finish by quickly mentioning how regulators and policymakers might want to respond to these type of harms, these categories of harms that I've mentioned, including algorithmic price discrimination, algorithmic targeting, algorithms that enhance our misperceptions and biases, and so forth. There are several categories of potential responses. I want to briefly mention a few because I know that Hans wants us to talk about them during the panel discussion later on. But I want to mention just a few of them quickly. The first is, or falls under the general heading of algorithmic transparency. Okay, so ideally, it would be great to know, if you're a regulator, it would be great to know, you would want to know if the algorithm is setting a higher price, okay, for Hans because he's richer, or if the algorithm is setting a higher price for Hans because they know that he's overestimating the value of a certain product or service. Okay? So ideally, this transparency would be very helpful to regulators, and there is a big debate among the computer scientists whether this is, transparency is even feasible with respect to these types of AI-powered algorithms, under what conditions it's feasible, and so forth. And again, there are bigger experts than I on the panel, Morton particularly, who can speak to this. Another set of regulatory approaches has to do with disparate impact type analyses. Okay, and so the idea here is that if we cannot understand the inner workings of an algorithm ex ante, okay, we might at least understand the outcomes that the algorithm produces ex post, sometimes called audit studies and so forth. Okay, and so the idea here again, what a regulator might want to do is to audit these algorithms that are used on consumers or used in consumer markets and see whether we have disparate impacts, okay, different outcomes. Now, this type of disparate impact analysis has been developed in the context of largely race and sex-based discrimination that I've mentioned and which I have not focused on, but the idea is that the same type of tools can be used to check for a disparate impact between more versus less sophisticated consumers. Okay, so this is another type of regulatory approach that I just want to put out there. And just to finally, and I view this as the ex-ante version of disparate impact, we can think, this relates to the discussion with Max in the previous panel, we can think of various types of fairness constraints that can be imposed on the algorithms by the policymaker, by the regulator. And again, usually the literature talks about fairness constraints in the sense of do not set different prices for men and women, for majority and minority groups of consumers, but we can also think about these types of constraints when we talk about more versus less sophisticated consumers. So with this, I will end. Thank you very much.
thanks a lot, and thanks that for the next examples you always refer to, Tommaso. I very much appreciate that. I think we should directly step into the next impulse talk. Emilio, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, I think I'm fine. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me here and organizing this fantastic day. I think we should have more of these conversations. I'm learning a lot, and so hopefully this will be a recurring thing. I have no slides for some reason, and I'm also in trouble. So I was scrambling to find a solution, and I found two solutions to this problem. The first one is, if I cannot entertain you with figures, I'll entertain you with stories. So I will start with 3 stories. And then over the lunch break, I skipped lunch, and I produced 1 slide. And so I do have 1 slide, so I don't know how this works, but later on, if you can, if you cannot, you'll survive without that 1 slide. Okay, so let me set the stage by considering these different scenarios, okay, which reflect my own research. Okay, so admittedly. Okay. 1. Competing companies, sorry, I have to read. I hope you don't fall asleep. Okay, that's the challenge for me after lunch. Stories without, okay. Competing companies supply consumer products competing heads-on on a popular e-commerce platform. When consumers search for that product category, the platform's AI algorithm personalizes search results, deciding which product should be at the top of the list. Consumers have limited time and limited information about quality and the suitability of those products for their needs. As a result, the algorithm shaping the ranking affects their collective purchase choices. By doing so, it ends up popularizing certain products at the expense of others, and it does so for no good reason. Firms exit, product choice is reduced, and prices gradually pick up. Okay, that's the first scenario. Scenario number 2. For a taxi driver in the Bay Area, a request for a ride from San Francisco to Berkeley, which is on the opposite side of the bay, stings. Driving away from downtown comes with a large opportunity cost in terms of lost rides. Because of this, the driver would accept the request only if expecting the rider to be a very good tipper. Okay? If I expect a good tip, I'll accept the request. The app, say, we'll talk about Uber or Lyft, can easily forecast the tip that a regular rider would leave, just by using data, and convey very precise information to the driver. However, the algorithm powering the app has learned that occasionally inflating the predicted tip increases the number of rides, okay, accepted, and therefore revenues. As a result, accepted rides and profits go up, but drivers from time to time, they accept trips that they later regret. Scenario number 3. Managers at competing companies independently decide to let AI fix the prices they charge. Due to the complexity of AI, these sellers are unable to foresee what will result. Over time, these algorithms, they learn to collude, as reflected in prices way above the competitive levels. Okay. Now, these scenarios, are intended for the rest of this talk as kind of illustrative examples of the challenges that AI poses to, the traditional approach in competition policy. And basically, I'll try to argue why AI is a different animal and why taming it is going to require a different approach, which, going back to why we should be having these conversations, right? So this is not just old wine in a new bottle. Now, the first point I'd like to raise is that AI conducts can be subtle and can be sophisticated, okay? And at the same time, these conducts can cause a lot of harm, okay? They can be invisible to the naked eye, but also to the trained practitioner's eye, okay? They can learn to exploit behavioral biases that we ourselves are unaware of. Think about the taxi driver example, Okay, in the taxi driver example, the goal of the AI was to pack information. So there is some information which is relevant for the choice. Is this guy a good tipper or not? This is relevant for the driver's choice. I can disclose the truth, or maybe I can disclose something else. I can kind of tell him some half-truth, like, with a large probability, I know he's a good tipper, but a bad tipper, but I can say, well, with a large probability, he's a good tipper, okay? That, if I do that, I can do that in a way that I'm still telling the truth just by pulling some bad tippers with good tippers, inducing those drivers to accept those rights. Okay, and the drivers know this. The drivers know that when they see the good tipper badge, they should discount that a little bit because, from time to time, you go to Berkeley for a bad reason, okay? That's the idea. Okay, so packing information, what do we know about that? AIs are very good at doing that, okay? In a way, this is a world in which applied theorists like myself are really happy in the sense, we've been theorizing, we've been producing theories of harm, and at some point, 10 to 15 years ago, we had this debate where colleagues would say there is too much theory, right? We should turn to the empirics, we should have more data, we should produce more empirical research. But as it turns out, to the extent that these tools are so sophisticated to be able to, find out and exploit, okay, some way of, say, capturing rents, then, in a way, what I'm seeing right now is a need for more theory, okay? Because these tools, they can think about ways to extract rents and harm consumers that are not obvious to us, okay? Now, I said that AI can be sophisticated, but I also think that AI can be very dumb, okay? So when I teach, I usually say that, even though we talk about intelligence and artificial intelligence, whatever that means, these are just blunt, dumb statistical tools. Like if I think about what companies use to estimate demand, and then I think, what I teach in my master's classes, structural estimation of demand, we're on different planets, right? So in a way, right, so they're dumb. And there is a problem with dumb tools that sometimes they fail to do the job that they're actually supposed to do. In the collusion story, right, where the AI increased prices, one possibility is that these two algorithms competing in this marketplace, they're so clever that they figure out a way to learn to coordinate, right? That's a tough problem, like learning to coordinate on these reward-punishment schemes that we call collusion. But they might also do something else. They might fail to learn to compete. So the reason why I'm seeing high prices is because they don't actually compete, so they fail. So think about picking a random price above cost. If every firm picks a random price above cost, which is the dumbest way of fixing your prices, profits will be typically larger than what you would get if you were actually competing, okay? If everybody was doing that at the same time. In the first illustration, we had a website, let's say it's Amazon, which is ranking products, and they're doing that because they're able to estimate our preferences. So the idea is, when I go to Netflix, Spotify, Amazon, they try to figure out who I am, and then they cater to that persona. Okay, they say, oh, yes, we should increase Emilio's engagement, we should show him this, we should sell him this, that's how it works. Those recommender systems, they try to increase sales, engagement, whatever. But, in some research with the usual suspects, we actually show that they miserably fail in estimating those preferences, and that failure in estimating those preferences is causing issues, okay? So, for instance, one issue is that they're creating concentration out of thin air. They're kind of thinking that our tasters, think about these machines, thinking that our tasters are more homogeneous than they actually are, and kind of over-recommending some items at the expense of others, with obvious consequences for the upstream markets and also for consumption diversity, right? That's an issue out of dumbness, okay, of these tools. AI is a black box, no transparency whatsoever, okay? So if you talk to those who develop these tools, and the kind of industry those who design these algorithms, they typically try to understand only after training them. Okay, so the idea is that, especially the most sophisticated models, they don't know what to expect. Okay, so the typical, process is, I design a model, I train it, I see if it cracks the problem, and now it does it, and then if it doesn't, I go back and I redesign it. But if it does, I don't know exactly how it works. So large language models are like this. Not even those who are designing these models can tell exactly what are the limits, what are the capabilities, what's exactly going on. So it's black boxes to the experts as well. AI is naive, okay? It's like a child, if you want. It's naive in the sense that sometimes they pull arms, they take actions that have unintended consequences, okay? And I remember Joshua Gans was saying earlier that, in these cases where you think there will be unintended consequences for these actions, we should do small-scale experiments, But then it's not obvious to me, when is it the case that we should expect a larger likelihood of those unintended consequences? The problem about unintended consequences is that we don't know when those will materialize, right? Otherwise, we would experiment. Okay. That's where my slide, okay, so there's not. Our automated split testing is something that we're not talking about, which I think it's very important. Let's see if the slide comes up, but there you go. So basically now we're in a world in which, in many choice situations, these algorithms are actually teaching themselves how to manipulate our choices. Okay, so they're using reinforcement learning to make us do things such as, say, click on the ads, or watch more videos, or buy more stuff, right? So, yeah, the AI is actually the dog there, which is doing this on its own. But when you automate these tasks, that's a problem, right? Because you don't know what's going to come out of these automated process, but companies do it all the time. AI shapes incentives, something else we're not talking about. Okay, in the example about Amazon, in the story about Amazon, I told you, well, AI shaping choices. Then, of course, now, in the old world, firms were trying to cater to consumers, right? In the old world, a firm was designing products that were appealing to customers. In the new world, in which if you're not on top of those rankings, if you do not show up on top of those rankings, you're dead, the first problem you have is to cater to the algorithm. Okay, what feature of my product are more likely to make it go at the top of those search result pages? That means that product design, product quality, prices, and all those decisions are meant to influence the output of the algorithm as opposed to kind of seduce the consumer into buying. Incentives are important, okay? We can talk more about that in the Q&A. I also got 2 more points. The industry culture is very different. We live in a world in which, as they say, do not ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, okay? So we develop a model, we throw it into the wild, we let people play with it. If something happens, we say we're sorry. We pull it out, we fix it, we throw it out there, okay? Think about developing a toothbrush or a simple consumer product. You would never do that. You would never, it's a completely different world, this one we're living in which, design a product, I see if it works or not, and then if something goes wrong. So, okay, so maybe we can talk in the Q&A about accountability and things like that. The last point I want to raise here is that we have not been talking very much about market failures, okay, in this particular context, in the sense that we usually think of saying competition kind of fixing these issues, right? If an AI is manipulative in some way, if Amazon's systems are manipulative in some way, then there will be a new, say, supplier or a new marketplace or a new platform which will deploy algorithms which kind of transfer more surplus to the users and things like that. Okay, so in this whole discussion, and also the one that we had this morning about, say, regulating this industry, I think the missing part was, okay, we're regulating this industry. Why? What is the reason? Like, let's talk about a particular industry. What is the market failure? Why we shouldn't expect like the competitive forces to actually help us mitigate the issues that some of the issues that I talked about. That is it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emilio. I think we directly move on, and we'll have then a structured discussion after the impulse talks. Moritz, please.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to learning from all of you. I'm a computer scientist. I also was tricked by Hans into not speaking with slides. And I was trained in computer science, which means I have no training whatsoever in speaking without slides. And so there's a little bit like bringing a chess player to a dance audition. So we'll see how this goes. But I think what's going to save me is brevity. So I'll keep it short and go into the discussion. I study machine learning, the foundations of machine learning, scientific foundations broadly, and specifically with a focus on social questions. So how machine learning works out in the social world. Study things like privacy, fairness, and some of these older concerns that we've had. And over the last 10 years, I've been specifically interested in the context or in the question of machine learning in markets and in sort of situations where you expect strategic behavior from the participants that are subjected to your machine learning algorithms. And that's what I'll talk about. But I'll start with a little bit of background. So, machine learning as we know it today is about 80 years old. It goes back to sort of the cybernetics era and the sort of enthusiasm about creating mechanical brains or digital computers that could emulate human brains. And it was focused on sort of pattern recognition. It was focused on the human ability to recognize patterns and to accurately classify patterns. And everything we see today is still a product of this technology of pattern recognition. It's nothing else. It has nothing to do with anything other than finding patterns in lots and lots of data. And so this is what has given us sort of deep learning and the revolution in computer vision, and then the revolution in language models. And this goes back really to sort of principles that are 80 years old. And so as a community, machine learning follows what the philosopher of sciences, Paul Feyerabend, calls anything goes. Okay, so the only principle that doesn't inhibit scientific progress is anything goes. Okay, and machine learning is the community that has implemented this. Okay, so people really try anything. Okay, so at our recent conference, there were more than 22,000 submitted papers, and we're really trying it all out. And so the community largely proceeds by trial and error. And the thing that makes this all work is what I call the iron rule of machine learning, is that at the end of the day, whatever you're doing has to sort of come out top on some kind of benchmark. Okay, so the community creates these sort of like data-driven benchmarks that measure how far our progress has gone, like ImageNet in the case of computer vision. And there is a contract that if you want to sort of eventually, want your stuff to be used, it has to do well on one of these benchmarks. Okay, and so this is really the driving force. Anything goes, plus this iron rule of benchmarking that has sort of propelled us from like recognizing triangles to generative language and videos. Okay, and so I'm interested in how the rules of the game of machine learning have to change if you apply machine learning in the social world and specifically in markets. And so let me give you an example of what's different and why machine learning in social contexts is inherently not a form of pattern recognition. Suppose I'm YouTube, and I do what they do, which is to predict watch time. Okay, this is the bread and butter of YouTube. I predict how much Hans is going to watch a particular video about the Digital Markets Act or something, whatever he watches on YouTube, van life, I don't know. And, and so YouTube thinks that, Hans is going to spend an hour watching this technical tutorial on the DMA, and it's going to rank this video #1 on his phone and on his browser. And he has almost no way to click anywhere else but to really watch this video and spend a lot of time watching it. And so this is clearly like an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so Hans's watch time of this video was heavily influenced by the prediction of that he would watch this video. Okay, so predictions in the social world generally influence the very thing that they're trying to predict. There's a causal effect from the prediction to the outcome that you're trying to predict. And so I found out who first discovered this, and it's exactly 100 years old. And I found out on a rainy day in Tübingen. I was walking or cycling back from somewhere, and it started pouring. And it was a Sunday, and nothing was open except the library. Okay, so I, find shelter in the library, and I'm bored. It rains, and I'm walking through the aisles, and I see this like leather-bound book, a very slim book, that says Morgenstern, Theorie der Wirtschaftsprognose. And I was like, all right. So I open this up, and it gives this brilliant account of how all statistics and econometrics is doomed. Okay. And it's doomed because, generally, empirical economic forecasts will deprive themselves of their empirical basis. Okay, so the moment if you're a central bank and you make some forecasts about the economy, people will trade based on it, and as a result, whatever empirical basis you had for making that forecast will have changed. You will have sort of like, as you said, saw off your own branch. The German expression, sich den eigenen Ast absägen. All right, that's what he said. Predictions generally do. Okay, they sort of like deprive themselves of their own data by invalidating the data that they were based on. So he very brilliantly described this. And so this is a notion that now in machine learning, at this point in time, we call performativity. Okay, so we call it performative predictions. And predictions are performative when they influence the target of prediction, okay? When they have some sort of causal effect on what you're trying to predict. So performativity means predictions are something that you perform. They're kind of an action and not just a form of like prediction, all right? So not just a form of observation. It's not just like astronomy, it's more like an engine, not a camera, okay? So that's what performativity means, and we formalized this in the context of machine learning, and we turned it into some kind of technical framework that machine learning people can use to sort of study what machine learning is actually doing in these different social contexts. It has all sorts of relationships to things like algorithmic fairness and strategic behavior and so on. So computer scientists are using this at this point. One of the things that comes out of this framework of performative prediction is a distinction, sort of a dichotomy between two things, two ways to be good at prediction. And these two ways to be good at prediction are learning and steering. And only learning is something that machine learning had recognized for the last 80 years, and steering is the thing that's new and fundamental to performative prediction. So what is the difference? Learning is all about finding patterns in data. It's about sort of static pattern recognition. Steering is about changing the data to something that benefits you. So if I'm YouTube and I sort of curate content distributions and modes of consumption on the platform that benefit me, for instance, because they're highly monetizable, that's a form of steering. And a lot of the harms related to AI that we're seeing are harms as a result of steering, the second mechanism that had gone unrecognized by the machine learning community for so long. Okay, so if you're a believer like me and you know this notion of performativity, you'll start to see it anywhere. And so the challenge I always give people is what I call the performativity hypothesis. So it says that all social prediction problems are performative, okay? And I have yet to find a counterexample, because in some sense, the whole point of making predictions in the social world is to influence outcomes, okay? So in some sense, you can't really avoid the performativity of prediction. But there's one important qualifier to the degree of performativity, okay? If Hans makes wild predictions in the convenience of his office, and maybe his students listen, I listen, but other people might not listen. Whereas if Google says you should go from San Francisco to Mountain View on US 101 and not on 280, people will go on US 101 and cause a traffic jam. Okay? So what I'm trying to say is that the degree to which your predictions are performative, the extent to which they have influence over people, depends on the power in terms of authority and reach of the person or institution that's making the prediction, okay? So the cause of performativity is power, okay? So the more power you have, the more performativity you can, in principle, have. And so if you turn this around, you can measure one's power by the degree of their performativity, okay? And this is a nice sort of corollary, because performativity is something that we can measure using statistical tools, causal inference, experiments, observational designs. There are all sorts of ways that we can study performativity, and they always give us conclusions about the power of someone. Moreover, it's kind of like you get to sort of measure these things in the dark. You can measure somebody's power without even knowing who they compete with. You don't need to know who's in the marketplace, what are the exact contours of the market, who's competing with whom. We can show that the performativity is sort of sensitive to all sorts of things like the existence of competitors, the existence of outside options, the degree of personalization. The more you can personalize, the greater your performative power, because it influences how much you can differentiate. And that is actually reflected in performativity. So all these like indicators of power actually bleed into this measure of performativity. And by just empirically measuring performativity, you can make inferences broadly about power. So this idea led to a notion we call performative power. And we started working out how this notion of performative power might be helpful in antitrust investigations. We've linked it to things like the Google comparison shopping site case of the European Commission, where we can really show how performative power comes in very nicely and can tell you exactly how much Google can sort of steer participants away from other comparison shopping sites and onto its own product offerings. And so I really think that this idea of performative power is kind of a tool that could be used in various detection and enforcement problems that the competition community faces. And so that's something I'm happy to discuss with all of you. I'll mention one more thing since this came up. Performativity also works two ways, okay? So if a company is very powerful and its predictions influence lots of people, the market participants can actually use this to their own advantage by contesting the platform, okay? And we call this algorithmic collective action. And it's the idea that participants of the platform come together to create signals in the data that then they exploit for better predictions and hence for better outcomes for themselves, okay? So for instance, freelancers on Upwork or any other of these gig platforms can strategically manipulate the platform algorithm collectively so as to get better labor market outcomes. And this only works because predictions influence outcomes. And so you can have influence on real outcomes by manipulating the learning algorithm. Otherwise, this whole thing wouldn't even work. So these are just some thoughts, and I'd be happy to chat more with all of you and the panelists in the next hour. Thank you very much.
Joanna, please.
All right, so what happened was that I got annoyed about not getting slides last time, so I have slides. So, but before I show the slides anyway, assuming that even works. Yeah, okay. I want to point out that one of the, this reflects both market power, and I loved that talk. I've not heard that before. And also what we were saying about regulation before. When we talk about AI itself as the subject, AI as the actor, yeah, please do. There's going to be, it's all for charts. That's why I bothered to do the slide. So please do get in the row here. It's going to do you better. Then we are letting the people who actually compose the system off the hook. And 3 of the 7 panelists of the last 2 panels have been doing that. So that was Max, and then Ellen and Enrico. Spoke of the AI and the algorithm. Now, especially on this panel, it was mostly in a way that seemed like sort of metaphorical. But when you forget that there's a company, when you don't talk about the AI as a tool, that there's a company and there's individuals, if we don't hold those people to account, when you talk about, well, look, forget about it because eventually there's an AGI, right? No, what you're saying is eventually some corporation fully evades regulation and accountability, right? A law is about dissuasion. We cannot hold digital systems to account. They don't have limited lifetimes, right? They don't care if they're in jail. They don't care if they lose power, money, wealth, whatever. You can make them care, but then you can make them uncare too. So it's just, we cannot control things that we design in the ways that we have evolved the legal systems and the ethical systems that we can look at. Even other social species use very similar strategies of like mobbing and things. So please, please, please do not talk about the AI itself as an actor, even as a shorthand. Okay. So that's enough of that. And I would say the black box thing is a special case of that, incidentally. It's true that we don't know what each little neuron is doing, but we also know how to build the systems. And we don't know all the outcomes, then we test them. It's just like we have a million other systems like that, cars, tanks, stealth planes, super complicated things, right? But you are responsible and obliged to go through and know what will happen. And a lot of what's happening in the DSA and the AI Act is that we are, either you're going to be able to show us your own records of what's been happening, or a customer will be able to demand and find out when would the transition have been, when would I have gotten the loan, and what were the parameter suites, what were the parameter settings that would have changed that. So these are the kinds of things we need to make sure that we're clear about where the accountability is. Anyway, that's all I have that's not from the slides. So I was asked to talk more about regulation, and I can't because I only know that much about digital markets regulation. And I'm keen to know, actually, Hans, do you know this woman in the middle here? Because she was also in, well, I don't know when she started, actually, but she's in the Director General of Competition. It's Helena Melikova. She was in the Apple case. That's where she became more famous. But she taught me what little I know, most of what little I know about market competition. And so, I heard a lot about that period you were talking about when you were there. It was a very exciting period. So, yeah. Okay, so I'm just basically going to start out with a case. Now, you might think, well, we're talking about AI here, which is part of the reason I thought it was worth taking the time at the beginning to protest the anthropomorphizing of AI, because I'm going to talk about telcos here. A lot of people right now are trying to get the EU to allow mergers between the telephone companies, because they say otherwise we can't get the kinds of band infrastructure that the U.S. has. So the U.S. gets more infrastructure because they allow more mergers, right, in telcos. Okay. So first of all, it doesn't look like this is just sheer investment. The blue is the U.S. and the red is the EU, right? So it doesn't actually look like, no, I've got that wrong. Like blue is the EU, red is the U.S., up is more investment. So what we're seeing is that we actually are getting more investment in infrastructure from the European companies. And I would argue that's what you expect with smaller companies. They are more likely to do what the government wants. When you allow these enormous scales of inequality that we're seeing now, well, governments become irrelevant and you basically enter a state of war, right? This is like right now we have the level of inequality and of polarization that's very similar to right before World War I, right? Immediately before and after, actually, World War I. Okay, so this is just like a color code. We're going to talk about how do you derive value from the main value that's happening right now, right? A lot of it comes from advertising. So people are paying to get at the eyeballs of consumers. So the consumers are on the left there. On the right are the companies that are trying to sell ads. I'm not really going to talk about these DSP things. You can choose or not choose to go through them. But anyway, whatever you do, you have to go through these digital ad exchanges. All right, so that's going to be the green. And then we're going to have also the telcos. The telcos are the things that are actually providing the stuff directly to the consumers, right? So not just telephones anymore, also all the apps and whatnot. Okay, so this is before investment in infrastructure. And you can just see, and what these axes are is that, let's see, the x-axis is the average profitability, right? So 50% of Facebook their ad market thing, 50% is profit, and the y-axis is growth. Okay, so telcos, all the things with sort of the dashed circles here. Again, the red ones are U.S., the blue ones are European, and they're making initially at this stage before investment in infrastructure, they're making almost as much as profit again as Google, which is really weird. If you go to the competition authority and say, oh, please let us merge, usually it's because you're losing money, all right? Look at how much money these guys are making, and still there's this claim that they need to be allowed to violate antitrust. But anyway, then these filled-in things are the actual content providers that you might think maybe deserve some money. And some of them, like Netflix notably, is growing, but the other ones aren't growing that much. There's already, the people already have telephones, so they're not growing very much, and there's not that much growth, but there is still profitability in these remaining media companies. So this is what happens after the investment in infrastructure. And what you see is that even Facebook invests a little tiny bit, so it not only has 45% profits, Google moved a little bit more. But you can see that, again, that the EU ones moved a lot more than the American ones. I would say, again, this is like my speculation, not Helena's, about that's because they're smaller companies, so they have less autonomy from the governments. And so they're doing more of what the government wants them to do. And they still are getting the level of profitability that the actual content providers are. So yeah, if you're looking at this chart and you're trying to figure out where could we be deriving more taxes, I would say why pick on the telcos? Why not go after the really large things, although those things are, of course, not European. All right, so that's that paper. As long as I knew that wasn't going to be 10 minutes, so I thought I'd throw in a couple other things. This is how Helena and I met. We were at a conference on market concentration, and there was this meme slide that drove both of us crazy. Because even so that's why I said, what little I know. One thing, even at MIT, they told us, like, too big of companies are bad. So I'm like, why are we seeing this chart about the biggest companies? It's just telling us where there's the least regulation, right? And she's like, well, and what even is a platform? How did they choose the top 80% of what, right? What is going on here? And notice that, it's like there's a conflation of China, like Samsung is China? No, right? So anyway, so we made another chart, she stayed up nights and weekends and figured out that she looked at now this is not all the AI in the world. This is just sort of a weird random subsample. So what her more objective criteria was that she had to have at least 2 patents in 2019 in a particular subclass of you're defending it globally in the WIPO, that was about computer systems based on specific computational models. Okay, so you're not catching everything here. This is just a subsample that, like, machine vision wouldn't go in there. And then, so now we're still using the circles because people love circles, but it's redundant information on, notice it's log here. The X is the market capitalization, the Y is the number of patents. And you can see that these are kind of independent of each other. So some companies are producing a lot of patents, for whatever reason of corporate culture. That's how they compete for their developers, whatever. But anyway, there's some kind of value that's being produced that way. And then the X is, like I said, what we know, Apple is producing lots of innovation, but it just doesn't choose to defend it that way since it builds its own hardware and its own software. It doesn't care. Whereas Google and Microsoft and IBM are all fighting for the same programmers. And so that's why they try to produce patents and give these guys another revenue stream, right? But anyway, in case your eyeballs aren't really calibrated, you can't sum circles, there's the actual picture. And so the reason we had been seeing that earlier chart, the misinformation chart, the meme, bad meme, evil meme chart, was because people were trying to say, look, there's a big competition between the US and China, and if Europe regulates the US, then China's going to win. Okay, and what we found out was actually Europe is actually comparable size to China. The rest of the world, not excluding China, the EEA, because that's what the GDPR covers, and the US, is actually bigger than China, the EEA combined by both of these metrics, which are both weird metrics, admittedly. But then the US is bigger than the entire rest of the world combined, or it was back at this time. So you could ask whether this is still true. Wiebke Dorfs used to be my master's student. Now she's like very senior in AI policy in Germany. And so it's hard to get this work done, but we're trying to finish. So in 2018 and 2019, so she went back and re-examined this, looking at every patent. Okay, every patent, huge amount of work. And you see again that the EU is actually ahead of China on the patents in that year. And then weird stuff happened during COVID. But anyway, the EU has been steadily growing its capacity. Notice that she also broke out Japan. So Japan was making up a lot of the IP there. And again, we don't know for sure. I mean, I had people from JP Morgan come up and say, we're upset we weren't in your 2020 paper. We're going to start filing WIPO patents in this particular thing. Like, what? Who cares, right? But so people care. So I don't know if it was because of our paper or some other reason that suddenly Japan and China went ballistic on their patenting. But anyway, now they're ahead, in some sense, ahead of the U.S. But the market capitalization, similarly, you can see, oh look, we were ahead in 2019, and then COVID came. And then guess what? The after COVID, the EU got ahead of China. Of course, China is suffering all kinds of problems. I do have 2023 data for both of these, and it looks pretty much like 2022, just similar trends. So I didn't bother to change it. With respect to that bubble, don't forget that there was just this massive pouring in of money during that. So this is just now, I should have said, this is the thing I talked about before, the advertising revenue, just what happened to print newspapers versus Google and Facebook. You can almost see the substitution there, right? It's just incredible. And other recommended reading, there's a lot of digital regulation. It's not all, a lot of it's AI intensive. It's not just all one act. Yeah, there it is. Woo! Okay, but anyway, yeah. I still think these ones are the most interesting, but there's a lot more going on. Another slide of Helena's. This is that paper I was telling you about that was showing about the balance of arrivals and departures from the EU. This is the other one about the GDPR that did the careful review from 2023 I was recommending. So it's Knut Blind. I forgot his name. But anyway, there you are. And I already told you that. There's the New Goliaths, which I mentioned before. There's the UNESCO report that I mentioned before. This I didn't mention, and it's not relevant to anything we're talking about, but I think it really matters, which is about polarization and who is actually spreading misinformation. It is the people who are polarized, but that's another part of my research. Feel free to ask about it. That was the end.
So thank you so much, Joanna. I think you compensated for the missing slides of the earlier presenters. So on average, I think we are as good as Hannes' panel was. So we are back in the race. That's good. So we have something like a 20 minutes for a quick run between us here across the panel, and then half an hour questions. I realized that the audience is here very active, so I will try to reserve those 30 minutes for the audience. But let's have a quick run, because I mean we were thinking that we go through the main topics jointly, and please everyone jump in. We wanted to briefly discuss the theories of harm and efficiencies. Won't go then to the detection issues. We'll discuss the remedies, and then while we are now focusing mostly, at least the first three panelists on the consumer markets, we'll then try to link it to the vertical stack and the market power which we are seeing there in the hardware and the foundation model layer of the vertical stack. But let me start with the theory of harm and efficiencies. I mean, what I took here from on your and Emilius, your presentation is that we roughly have this two type of theories of harm. Some of them are being more related to some form of exploitation, and the other one more being related to some form of collusion. And I was just wondering if we think for a second from a big picture, and you gave also some nice indications about the different markets being affected. Is there anything what one can say whether exploitative abuse is more of a problem for society than the collusive impact of AI? And can one say something about markets which are affected by one or the other? Is there anything you have seen in the research on that one?
So I want to say two things, and this is again maybe indirectly responsive to Hans's question. So first of all, I don't view this as a kind of a mutually exclusive thing that we need to choose which one is more harmful. A caveat to that, though, is that many enforcement agencies are working on a kind of a triage mode. So because of the enforcement budgets are limited, it is important to identify the markets that are more susceptible or most susceptible to harm and need to get kind of priority in the enforcement activity. So I agree with you, it would be great to kind of compare these harms. Now, in theory, we can measure consumer surplus or harms, reductions in consumer surplus in both of these for the exploitation context and for the kind of collusion or market power context, and we can compare these on kind of on the same metric. The one thing that I do want to emphasize, which is kind of important on the exploitation side, and this goes to kind of the relationship between competition policy and consumer protection policy. It is kind of often, a truism that we can, by protecting competition, we also protect consumers. But it's important for me to note that there are situations where a market can be very competitive in the sense that sellers are not making any super competitive profits at all. But nonetheless, they can be harming consumers and harming consumers significantly. So that's kind of maybe the core of the exploitation model. So a monopolist can exploit consumers, but sellers in a competitive market can also exploit consumers. And kind of the main point here to understand is that if there are two sellers competing in the market, and one of them has decided, I'm going to take the high road, I'm not exploiting, I'm not using my AI-powered algorithms to find the right kind of discriminatory pricing or the right targeting of products, I'm not going to use that, okay? I'm a high road seller, then very quickly in a competitive market, I'm going to lose out. I'm going to lose business to the low road seller who is willing to kind of set free their AI. Okay, so I'm focusing on the seller, not on the algorithm, because Joanna told me to. Okay, but if the seller is deciding to set free their algorithm, they're going to win. Okay, and so the idea here is competition is basically going to force you to use your algorithms in an exploitative mode. So not directly responsive, but that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was interesting because most sectors, again, this is like what I've said before about the nobody actually sitting around and figuring out how to optimize their shareholders' value. That's not their main. It's a goal, but it's not the main goal. Similarly, most sectors don't want to race to the bottom. They don't want to live in that kind of world. They do care about things, and not only for reputation, And so again, talking to I won't say which of the GAFAMs. They were just saying, you wouldn't believe the amount of resources we spend making sure that other people don't do the bad things that we've all agreed we shouldn't do. And I'm like, that's what governments are for. Other sectors get together with the governments, write laws, and then rat each other out and let the governments enforce, right? And these guys, literally their jaws just dropped. They had never thought that you should use government that way. They only think of it as some weird alien force that's somehow invaded and stopping them from doing things or something. But actually, governments are massive enablers. We're trying to make it so that our economies are thriving. So, yeah.
Okay. Emilio? Oh, yeah, it's directly. Just use.
Yeah, so, okay, so just a quick comment. Yeah, so the Article 5 of the AI Act talks about, say, materially conducts, okay? So materially distorting the behavior of that person or a person belonging to that group in a manner that causes harm, okay? And then, going back to your question, what is harm, right? So it's not, when you're exploiting in the ways we've discussed, then that's clearly a consumer protection issue. We should intervene and so on and so forth. But in many of the examples that I raised, these companies, they were just exerting market power, okay? So think about, say, Amazon ranking those products in a way that makes sellers happy. Think about Amazon ranking products by selling the slots at the top of the search result pages, okay, to those who are willing to pay the most for our attention. They're clearly trading off our surplus for, the seller's surplus, right? It's a platform, it's complicated. Is this harming consumers? Yes, it is. Is that a problem? Not sure, okay, right? So these firms, they're maximizing profit. So same goes for the information packing story where, you want to increase the number of rides and, maybe you withdraw some of the information because on the one hand, drivers' surplus will go down because from time to time they will do trips that stink, but on the other hand, there's more supply of cars. And so when I have to go to Berkeley, my request is not always declined, okay, by default. And it's complicated. So, my thought is, we should really be talking about harms in this domain, that go beyond, what we kind of agree already that are things to be fixed. And in a way, I think we're flying blind. So I guess, I hope we're going to do more research. Yeah.
So Hans, can I, so you said we might do this as a conversation. So Emilio, I'm wondering, just to push back a little bit, if we're thinking about the ride, the taxi example, can we just say, well, look, who do we care about? Okay, so we definitely care about the drivers. We care about the people who are seeking rides to Berkeley. Can't we measure? So we can measure kind of the surplus of each one of these groups. A lot of this is like a transfer between the groups. So we'll have to have like a kind of a normative assessment of distribution, what we care about, because one of the implications would be if I get fewer rides because the algorithm works in one way, does not cheat me, then means that if I want a ride from San Francisco, I had to tip better to get a reputation and be a better tipper, and so less money to maybe the consumer, more to the drivers.
Right.
But we can, at least in theory, if we can define our social objective function, and who are the people that we care about, the groups that we care about, can't we make the calculation and decide?
Yeah, I guess we could, but that is a kind of ambitious, right? So because these are difficult things to measure, and my presumption is that even if companies can measure it, then it's not obviously the case that there is a wedge between, say, their incentives and the consumers' incentives, and I just don't know how we could operationalize what you just said, like, go and measure and then say, what would we say to companies? Why don't you, it's not like flipping a switch, right? So resolving these trade-offs, these are complex trade-offs. And on top of that, some of these trade-offs are solved by machines, as I was saying. So, these companies, they would go on and kind of train machines that would kind of autonomously design those kind of badges in a way that increases profits. And so works in theory. I'm not sure we will ever be able to find a political agreement on how to distribute surplus across various actors in a given industry. But even if we were, how would you do it?
I want to jump in as
Sure.
the computer scientist because I feel like what just happened is sort of a symptom of two economics people getting nerd sniped, and I'm hearing like all these buzzwords, and it's about like surplus and dollar term things, and so I feel like that already presupposes a certain kind of frame of conversation for this whole problem that might be missing the bigger problem of like all the harms that are harder to quantify in sort of utility terms. And I'm thinking about the mental health crisis caused by TikTok, and the information crisis caused by Facebook and other platforms, and our inability to quantify them. And to me, as somebody who likes to do experiments, what I find, there are two things that I find particularly challenging. One is that a lot of the effects we're interested in are group effects. They're large-scale effects. They don't manifest when you run an RCT. You just don't see them because the RCT measures unilaterally some response, assuming everyone else stays put. Sort of a unilateral causal effect, and we're interested in group effects. What happened if the platform did this whole thing? And so it's generally very hard to extrapolate these causal effects from experiments to platforms. And so I was very skeptical when people said things about small-scale experiments and so on. And it can be very hard to learn from these experiments. The other issue is that a lot of them happened, over the course of repeated exposure, and also, again, very hard to measure. And finally, I think one thing I wanted to say about like where the harm is located, and that makes it really challenging. It's not just the algorithm and the sort of predictions produced by the algorithm or the information released by the algorithm, but also the interface design of the platform that actually has pretty profound consequences for what harms we're seeing. And for instance, are you just seeing like a long, never-ending stream of videos coming at you, or do you have some ways to meaningfully engage with the content? And I think there's no very good, HCI researchers will say they've been studying this, but there's no good, theories of harm with respect to interfaces. How do we commit harm through the interfaces that display information and so on? And some of our current thoughts on this are in this direction of how do we, do some of these steering and manipulation through the interface design itself, and less so through algorithmic levers. And all of these I see as like challenges for even like saying where the harm occurs.
Oh, can I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Because there's another part of this that we haven't mentioned much here, but a lot of panels I'm on really come in on this too, which is the harm of the loss. So you can point out some of the problems that people had with Twitter too, but in fact, Twitter was probably the most powerful political communication device we had, and it was being used not only for, like, for example, during COVID, people who read Twitter were better informed than average, whereas a lot of social media, they were less well informed than average. But it was also that a bunch of governments, it was the official COVID policy was being broadcast on their Twitter channel. They didn't have a better, more secure channel. It was the best thing they had. And then I'll just make thirdly, the last one I'll do on this positive one, was that people were able to use, like researchers were able to go in and use Twitter to see what was going on in real time during disasters. So they were able to assist with real-time emergency assistance, like during hurricanes and things. They could tell where there were problems, what was going on. All this information was there. Since Musk, I'm tempted to say emasculated, but that's really bad. I don't know why I thought that. But anyway, eviscerated the Twitter, that you can't do those good things anymore. It is still, a lot of the elite are still following each other, but that capacity to go in, the ordinary people cannot find what they were looking for anymore. Yeah, a whole lot of people that were making money off of like showing, like people seeing their news stories or their blog posts or their web comics, suddenly they got no visibility anymore. And but most, to me, most terrifyingly, back to this public good as a political communication device, was that the disaster interveners could no longer do it. The bots were swamping the information, and you could no longer help people. So we lost a way that we were doing emergency assistance, right? And that was, coming back to market concentration and antitrust. And the flip side, when there's things that cannot be replaced easily through a lot of competition, then it's the utility. And I think that the U.S. has fallen down on its job, its job that it created for itself, of recognizing public utilities and defending them. There's just no way that it should have been sold into private ownership, right? But I do think it was facilitated by academics that were saying, oh my God, but look at this little harm, and focusing too much on the harms and not enough on the benefits. I do think that helps facilitate that sale going through.
I find this point about that it's not just about theories of harm or of harms, but also that there are some positive elements which could come from AI. I mean, not only the big ones, which we are realizing. I mean, nobody wants to move back to a world without any online dictionary or something like that. So, I mean, if you think about some of the markets where I think the negative effects of algorithmic pricing were identified, like the gasoline markets, they're often the original regulation tried to empower the end consumer to have higher price transparency. So actually, I mean, the foundation for the algorithms to collect prices and to do this kind of collusive price setting potentially was for the reason of empowering end consumers and giving higher transparency to end consumers. So my question here to the panel is that, I mean, this still seemed to me a good vision, that AI and the additional know-how which we are getting from it, and remember my earlier introduction, this is a disruptive innovation. Suddenly we can go outside the scope of our old information systems and we may gather more information. Can it also empower consumers? I mean, is it that we can come into a situation where we get better prices, lower prices for better products based on AI? Or is that a too positive vision?
So if I may, I can try. So I think it's absolutely true that we have AI-powered algorithms that are helping consumers. So we go on and use these apps and search engines to search for better products, higher rated products, higher quality products for lower prices. All of this can be done. There are now these, as you know, the digital butlers like like Alexa or Google Home or all these other Siri. What they do is they help us purchase stuff. They find things that we need. And they help us maybe look for better for better products and better prices. So there is, and there's kind of this another side. So Johanna talked about kind of the Cold War, which does not exist, but there are people who talk about kind of the battle of the algorithms, or the war of the algorithms between the seller-side algorithms and the consumer-side algorithms. Okay, so in theory, it could be interesting. I mean, so potentially we have algorithms that are supposed to help consumers, okay, and it would be interesting to look at the kind of the interactions, kind of simulate interactions between these types of algorithms and see what the outcome is. I am personally less optimistic about this under the current configuration, and the reason for that, again, goes back to incentives. So it seems like that the main consumer-side algorithms that are currently in the market are being kind of run or affiliated by large parties on the seller side. So if it is Amazon or Google or Apple. And so I don't really trust them to be really, you know, have the consumer's benefit fully and only in mind. But in theory, if we can have independent, high-quality consumer-side algorithms, it would be, you know, a good thing.
Just adding to that, I agree, and I may be like getting a little bit of flack for this, but I'm somewhat of a contrarian about language models, because I think they're actually an example of one of the better tools that came out of AI recently. I find them tremendously helpful for navigating all sorts of situations. For instance, semi-legal bureaucratic situations that consumers face where they are confronted with some legalese, they have no idea what it means. You just paste it in there, say rewrite in normal English, rewrite in simple English, translate to this and that. So tremendously powerful, and has actually reduced sort of friction and also like inequalities in a bunch of places where people that were previously less informed or didn't even know how to read that stuff could now suddenly respond to like a 300-page request by the Oakland Housing Authority to like get their housing back, right? And I think it's these kind of things that where I think they're actually kind of helpful. And one thing that brings me back to the previous thing I said, if you think about the interface in GPT, it's an interface that always, at the very least, required some kind of conscious input from the user, right? You never just like sit there and just like drown, right? You just actually have to like do this minimal bar of typing in a question into this thing. And so it always has like, clears like a minimal bar of intent. And like eliciting intent is an extremely powerful interface design trick. We saw this in the case of Twitter when I worked there. Twitter mostly is a stream, but there used to be a hidden sort of setting where you could click on the info of a tweet and then click somewhere else and then click on show less often. And we found that on all the signals that we had on Twitter available, retweets, likes, blah, 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 this was the most informative. It let us identify all sorts of things that we couldn't do without this. Why? Because it would elicit intent, right? Like you really like made people break out of their sort of like automatic mode and just sort of really think about this for a sec and then do something with it. And actually, this is why I think this like text interface is one of the more clever interfaces that we've seen compared to some like doom scroll like TikTok or something. And I'm more optimistic about the scope of language models for all sorts of things. And I wish enforcement was focused more on like Instagram and TikTok and the mental health crisis related to that than about like GPT-4, you know. That's just my take. Yeah.
I didn't know you worked for Twitter. I actually, this is really important coming back to TikTok and Instagram. But unfortunately, Twitter went down that path too. But originally, it had been all, you saw what you followed. And I was always mystified by people complaining about the rubbish they saw on Twitter. I'm like, unfollow the people producing it. You know, it's not hard, you know. But then as people were nudged towards recommenders, it became harder and harder to communicate that. But I think one of the really important things coming back to regulation that Jack Dorsey said about what went wrong was he said, we made a mistake when we started building tools to let so that we could control our users' experience. So basically, they kind of had been asked to do that. But he said we should have spent the time. As soon as we had those tools, then people started demanding access to them. Advertisers, activists, board members, governments, they were all demanding to control people's experience on Twitter. He said we should have spent the time producing tools so that users could fix their own experience. And I think that's what there was originally, but unfortunately, the people were demanding that they found a larger range of users. So I think that's part of what destroyed it. But anyway, there's a really big difference, and what drives me insane is that because I don't like the fact I come in on it on For You. For You is really accurate. It's a bunch of my friends saying things that drive me up the wall that I would normally spend huge amounts of time on. And I have to like try to avert my eyes and click on the list I actually want to read of the things that I, as an adult researcher, has decided is the right way for me to spend some time today. You know, and so that's Instagram and TikTok don't allow you to have moral agency. They do not allow you to have that kind of choice. And so I agree that it's like a fundamentally different product.
Emilio.
You know, I'd like to push back also a little bit on this idea that, you know, these are great tools that, you know, from time to time they might hallucinate or whatever, and so we're fine. Actually, I think these are very complex objects and can have, you know, can be very harmful think about figuring out that Twitter or X or whatever, because of, you know, the algorithm locking individuals into echo chambers or rabbit holes, are kind of ended up manipulating an election. That's very important, and we still don't have evidence. We do not have like definitive evidence that is not the case, right? Think about these LLMs, which are very good, you know, when you have to look up a recipe or whatever, trip to Berlin, but, you know, they might end up in the hands of a teenager who might be fragile and might do things that she wouldn't have done otherwise if she hadn't had access to this technology. I would be very concerned as a father if my daughter were, you know, to interact with these tools. And sometimes, you know, if you look at the, you know, GPT-4 system cut, right, in which they explain the kind of great lengths that they went through to test these systems, it's literally a joke in the sense that, you know, there is little or no testing relative to how much, you know, of these, relative of how intrusive these tools are in everyday life. So, for instance, you know, I study recommender systems. I'm mostly interested in their effect on product market competition. So then I go to the system card of ChatGPT-4. Of course, people use it also to ask, what's the best restaurant in town, right? What's the best bagel in town? And they did some of these tests, and they concluded that, you know, GPT-4, for some reason that we don't understand, always tends to recommend the same bagel place in New York. And that's it, okay? Now, these are complex objects that, in my opinion, can cause considerable harm, and they should be regulated. So these tools, before being marketed, released, they should undergo a series of tests to make sure that they're safe, like we do with toothpaste, like we do with food, like we do with many other consumer products, right? And they, at the moment, I think the only thing closer to getting to this goal is the AI Act, which is trying to build you know, an institutional infrastructure for dealing with these things, is trying to build accountability and things like that. But we're very far away, and you know, I really get nervous and irritated when I hear kind of the industry lingo that this is important, we have to innovate. Like, if we stop innovation, look at all that surplus that is going to get lost. And so we cannot stop. And then, you know, you're foolish if you think that you can regulate this complex object, as if we're not regulating complex objects like molecules, like drugs, like vaccines. We do RCTs in the middle of the pandemic simply because we thought there could be a tiny chance that a very small fraction of the world population could have a side effect. We waited like 3, 4, 5 months before rolling out vaccines, that it was already clear that we're going to save lives, right? So we really care about those side effects not being there, and for some reason in this industry, it seems that we don't. Am I right?
Yeah, so with this confusion, I think we stop here the panel discussion for a second. We have a lot of additional questions, but I would like to open the floor to the audience, and I see already a first question on the left side. Please think about your own question. Hannes, you will come thereafter. Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm Christian, Director of the Consumer Policy Institute here in Berlin, and thank you for this wonderful panel, and I would have hoped that it is an hour longer. But Hans, I would like to come back to your initial question. Your initial question is, looking back to the regulation that we put in place in the 2000s and 2010s, what can we learn in terms of the new challenges? So when I think about the customer journey, so after I, as a consumer, might have realized that I have a need for a new washing machine, I search for information. In the past, I Googled, I used the comparison site. In the future, I will simply ask my AI assistant. And then the AI assistant will give me maybe a very concrete recommendation to buy a Bosch at MediaMarkt for this and this price. So when we look at the old world, in the old world we had regulations in place that said, okay, this comparison portal would need to have a comprehensive overview and need to take into account the different offers that there are. There shouldn't be commission-based ranking, or if it's paid, it needs to be clear that it's advertisement, and so on and so forth. And the major criteria of how the search results are ranked need to be transparent. So can we apply a similar approach to this AI assistant, so that this AI assistant needs to ensure that his recommendation or her recommendation is based on a comprehensive market overview, that there shouldn't be commissions-based recommendations? So what do you think about, this regulation of these kinds of AI assistants? Second question, when it comes to consumer authorities, consumer organizations, they are obviously providers of independent consumer advice. Nowadays, they fight hard to be on Instagram, on Facebook, and wherever. So in the future, how do they ensure that kind of public health, independent knowledge is integrated in the recommendations of these support systems? So what should a public affairs PR person in such an authority do in order to ensure that kind of this wise and independent advice is fed into these systems? And do we need to get regulations so that ChatGPT takes these recommendations into account?
Yeah, good question. My quick answer is yes, and I think if you're regulated, then you have the market-wide, the obligation to have a market-wide review, so then they have to take in their recommendation system also the consumer opinion serious. But I give it to the panel. So what do we make out of it? Oren, do you have a view on it?
So just very quickly, so my answer is also yes, obviously, but the question is how and how easy it is to do. And so it seems like when we're talking about kind of ChatGPT, the way it is trained, the way it is programmed, it might be harder to impose the direct type of constraints and regulations that we've seen before. That doesn't mean that we can't do anything. So, again, the idea of imposing these kind of audit studies. So if we do, we run it and we see it's always the same bagel shop in New York that comes out, this would be a red flag for me as a regulator to see if something is wrong with your algorithm. But I don't know enough to tell you exactly how can we. So what would be the thresholds for these types of?
But why do you think it's so complicated? I mean, it seems so. I mean, whether I get I do query research on Google, I get my list. Now I do this ChatGPT in a full question setting, but I get my list. Why do not apply the same regulation? I don't see the complexity in it.
So maybe I'm missing something. It depends on what we thought the older generation models were doing. So if we can just tell them, look, you can't just consider 5 places. You have to consider all of the places when you're doing the comparison. One could say, and again, that ChatGPT is, or whatever, GPT-4, they have access to all of the information in the internet, so they already have everything. Okay, but the way, this goes back to maybe Emilio's point in one of his examples, the question of how they choose to select one over the other, to the extent that that is, it's not transparent to us. It might be more challenging to make sure that we get the right, the full range of outcomes. But I leave it to the experts.
Other views on that? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Sure. Well, right. So ChatGPT, this whole conversation, especially your turn take there, is really making me think of the extent to which this stuff very well could be regulatory evasion. That we can think about it that way, because we did get to the point. Like, this is an excellent question. I haven't heard it before. I don't know anyone working on it right now about how to make sure that you do privilege the most objective, the demonstrably objective information. And we can't, I think we have solved that, at least Google has solved that with search, right? So we do get the stuff ranked kind of in whatever. There's ways to get that to work, and then it's like the companies don't want to spend that effort and they want to be able to throw their hands up in the air. I have literally heard this from Facebook engineers. First of all, that people get in trouble for telling Mark Zuckerberg things because Mark Zuckerberg's job is to go in front of Congress, and so he doesn't want to know. He doesn't want to have to lie. So he doesn't want to know, and he gets really angry when people tell him things. But also that Facebook is coming up with this fiction that they can't possibly understand their algorithm, and so they're actually figuring out how to reward each other because of using causal reasoning about well, when did you update the code base? When did we start making more money or achieve our goals? but they don't want to even try to understand how it works. And I'm like, if all you're trying to do, this goes back to this optimization conversation. If all you're trying to do is have this, some particular outcome, that's one thing. But what the regulators have to do is to say, no, one of your target tasks is having a person who actually has efficacy in your company, that has power, that gets a lot of money, that does understand it, can find out the answer, and that is responsible. So that is one of your targets. So you're not going to have perfect, just like that we don't have perfect access to our own internal understanding, but that's and banks don't entirely know who it is that stole the money all the time when money is suddenly missing, right? But nevertheless, you can do a pretty good job by making that one of the targets, and that's the regulatory landscape we have to be creating right now. And as I said earlier, we are apparently having some success, that the companies are going to understand themselves better, and I bet that their rate of innovation will go up as they start complying with these regulations.
You want? Hannes.
Okay, thanks. So I wanted to briefly comment on Emilio's point regarding culture in AI industry. So my personal impression has been this has been the case in software industry for very long. If you look at Microsoft, for example, I think they've always delivered a broken product that we then in the end had to fix. But that's just a personal view. And I wanted to, in particular to ask Moritz, so can the performativity measure that you explained, can that also measure in a way value and not only power? Because so particularly in platform markets with network effects, they're tightly linked, right? And so we might want to distinguish between the two to make normative statements.
Can I just ask, because I wanted to ask exactly also on this question, so do you talk to antitrust authorities or do you do just your research? Because that is something that I find extremely worrying now. So as an economist, I talk a lot to antitrust authorities. Lawyers talk to antitrust authorities. But the complexity of the issue we are discussing are very technical. And my feeling is that very often these authorities do not have the technical capabilities. So do you talk to them? Do you think that they can have these capabilities or they can buy these capabilities?
Yeah, so the development is very recent, and I was reluctant to sort of prematurely come out swinging with some kind of broad policy proposal or something like that. But I think we're now at a point where we kind of are very much sort of prepared for that conversation. And so we're talking to some, policy people and competition folks. If you're in that community, feel free to reach out if there's something they're interested in. I think we now have a lot more to bring into that conversation. But it's pretty recent, and so for the last couple of years, we have been mostly working on the theory, the empirics, the experiments to make sure we have a sound proposal and not just sort of wing it. But there's a lot more we can share now, and so yeah, I'd be very happy to deepen that conversation. And then there was the question about by Hannes about value versus power. Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. I think performativity at the outset gets at potential and not about manifested harm, right? So it's measuring a potential to commit some sort of harm. You can then couple it with like some theory of harm to see how it plays out, right? But it's sort of like one wheel and sort of the broader machine of an antitrust case, I would say. You still need sort of the substantive grounding of like, why was somebody harmed, right? I mean, ultimately that's sort of where like some normative judgment has come in that can't come out of the technical definition alone, right? And so there's sort of two components that need to connect. But this is one component which in some sense gives an answer to sort of what is the causal question that you need to answer in an antitrust case. And I think that's what it is.
And Moritz, if I may now do the prognosy that performativity will become a very, you have to think
maybe
about it.
Maybe we should rename this or something.
Performativity becomes a very important measure in antitrust over in the next 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And say this turns out to be true in 2 or 3 years. How do you then distinguish between the value of the idea which is behind it, that's a good idea, and my steering power here as a chairman to marketing it to an influential audience? Help me. How is that? How do you separate those two elements?
I would say, your performativity is vastly greater than mine, so you will have more success with that. So are you just to understand your question, are you saying how much of this is like sort of the quality of the definition versus just somebody deciding that we should apply it, or what is?
No, I just want to understand, Ben, when you are applying this test, I guess you have to distinguish between this kind of learning about the preferences of people and the quality behind it, and the steering power of a specific platform. In this case, it's me as a chairman.
Oh, that's what you mean. Okay.
And I just wanted to understand: how do you control for that? Is that
so we've done this, for instance, for Google search, understanding how much of a click is performativity versus preference, and you could do this using sort of in-browser randomized experiments that we've done. We call this Power Meter. It was a browser extension we had running for about a year. It was mostly done by my colleague Celestine Mendler, and so we found that, like, I forget the fraction, but most of the cause of a click is performativity. So it's the position, the forcing that comes from the positioning and not the content. And so you can sort of tease them apart. But there's a sort of interesting question. It's like, what's the unit of performativity, right? I think, this doesn't come out of the abstract definition, but more out of the context in which you apply it. And you need to relate it to something else.
Okay. Good. Joanna?
I just want to say, Microsoft always sucked. No, seriously, there is something really interesting, and you guys are economists, please tell me about, everyone knew that Microsoft was doing all kinds of dirty things. Well, everyone in software knew they were doing all kinds of dirty things. I was working for, I can say this now, I think NCR in the 90s, and when the case was in the headlines, and they said, we all thought you guys just complained about them because, you were jealous of how much money Bill Gates had. But yeah, we would never allow this kind of behavior in our sector. Now that they're reading the headlines, they saw that. But nevertheless, there were a lot of other software companies doing the right things, and specifically about things like revision control. Every software company is keeping good revision control, even Microsoft now. But a lot of AI companies weren't, and we don't know why. But I was in the financial industry in the 80s, and everybody knew who were the companies that ripped off their clients and who were the companies that were actually good, like everybody on the trading floors. This is Chicago, right? And then a decade later, I watched the Enron movie, and it was still the same, but evil people were still the evil ones. And so I don't understand how it is, but it does seem like that both good and evil companies persist side by side for a surprisingly long time in a lot of sectors. And I don't know how that works, but anyway.
If may add one thought on this. So actually, an interesting development which characterizes this industry is that we're basically delegating managerial decisions to machines, but these machines are not designed by managers, okay? So these machines are designed by computer scientists who could be completely oblivious or not know exactly what are the boundaries, for instance, or the legal boundaries, or what kind of potential issues these machines can cause. So for example, think about the recommender systems. Well, we'll talk about that for a while now. So think about a recommender system that does a good job in the sense that it increases user engagement. So users are getting the products they want. They're happy with their products. They're not getting maybe the best product for them in the catalog, but they're getting a good compromise, okay? But at the margin, this recommender system, for some reason, it's kind of favoring one manufacturer over the other, okay? To the extent that one manufacturer now has like twice the market share of the other. Now, from the point of view of those who design the system, to the extent that users are happy because these are like close substitute products, that's not an issue. Engagement is up, everything works. People are watching, listening, buying, whatever. But from a competition policy perspective, we have a huge problem. So any manager that was designing this system would have thought about, say, not driving too much traffic towards one particular seller, right? And then that's another thing that I think we need to fix, and that goes back to this point of industry culture, right? Where we kind of unleash things out there, and just sometimes we might cause harm that we do not even detect, and then that should change.
But I mean, Emilio, you're really believing that those systems are just run by crazy engineers? I think No. That was not my statement at all. I said that these are run by excellent
engineers, okay, who are doing their job.
Yeah, but I mean,
who are doing their job. But the point is that their job is to not take into account these kind of consequences that anyone who's been trained as a manager, say in an MBA program, would take into account. Because they know that, for instance, you should make sure that whatever system you're deploying to price gasoline is not ramping up prices, in conspiracy with the nearby stations, right? But I wouldn't think of us, computer scientists to think
they understand the concept of profit, but not of compliance. That's what you're saying. Or?
I mean, this is just one illustration, but I would say that, again, they're not really competent to, fully evaluate the consequences of the systems that they're designing and deploying.
Can I briefly jump in? Okay. Okay, yeah, sorry. Let's start with that.
Hi, yes.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Gina Hurtado. I am from Peru. I represent an organization called the Cuyaiki Foundation. We look to forward technology in the Andes among children and youth. My question or comment is I have a 9-year-old who, whenever she gets a chance, she gets on my phone and talks to Meta on WhatsApp. And she has these very deep philosophical conversations with it that really worry me, because there are a lot of lies that the Meta tells her, assumptions. And so, I check these conversations and then I have conversations with her about this. But my question is, what is being done as far as the access for children?
I'm her brother, so I wanted to squeeze that question. I'm a computer scientist, and I'm a Science and Technology Policy Fellow from the AAAS, the National Science Foundation. And I recently started playing around with transformers, and there are tons of videos on YouTube of how to build them, and that's the technology behind ChatGPT. So I'm also questioning myself, who's pushing that narrative that they're so dangerous? That is it the companies themselves that are gonna restrict, like, who has access to that technology, who can create those transformers? So I'm always really on the fence as far as, like, if they are pushing this narrative that they're so dangerous and they are the only ones that can create those transformers or algorithms, then that's something I'm worried about. Thank you.
So I will just say really quickly that on the second question, what Joanne said earlier completely nailed it, that it was really just Sam Altman's story of, like, close the door behind me and make OpenAI a natural monopoly and make sure nobody else gets this. So this story of, like, insane fear about this technology, it was largely driven by Sam Altman and the sort of Silicon Valley people who are building these tools. And somehow it found a lot of ears in Europe, and it pained me greatly that European policymakers and politicians were so different to Sam Altman and his narrative, and I thought that was a massive own goal. So what you said earlier really rang true to me. On the first question, just keep your kids off of it. All these platforms, I have no faith that these platforms are good for children. I would just keep them off. That's my take on this.
Yeah, I was going to say that similar to the second part. Actually, thank you for the second part. But to the first part, so to me, it's much more problematic that this stuff is being presented as whatever these lies are happening, because I mean, I guess we could talk about vulnerable users, but I don't think age is the main determinants of that. But age detection is really, really hard. I mean, although Meta complains it can do it except on WhatsApp because of the privacy on WhatsApp. So it claims that it's incredibly accurate. But I think one of the big problems we saw in the UK apparently just this entire piece of legislation they've been working on for years is just quietly scrapped in the announcement for the new election. But one of the problems was it's a lot easier to figure out sort of the mental age of someone than the actual age, right? And that's probably actually what we more want. We want to know whether people are able to discriminate that they're just having fun, or if this might be an oracle from God or something, right? We want to know that, but legally that doesn't fit with the rest of the law. The rest of the law has something that, like, up until you're 17, you have all these obligations to the parents, and the minute they turn 18 in the UK, they are fully autonomous, and you don't have the right to tell the parent anything. right? So that's the law system that the UK was trying to force technology into, and you cannot easily detect those kinds of things. But anyway, I support what was said before.
We are coming a little bit to the end of our time. I would like to close a little bit the circle of our discussion here by by coming back to my introduction, because I mean we were discussing here AI. It has a potential of being a disruptive innovation, and hence could shake up a little bit existing structures in the digital industry. Actually, we see still a lot of competition for AI-driven applications. So when we are discussing here consumer markets, I think there are many programs around which you can rely upon for building your algorithmic pricing strategies. We see still also some competition on those foundation models where new players are showing up in the market. And when we are moving then more down and down to the cloud services and the chip manufacturers, I mean, it seems to be already a pretty concentrated market. At the same time, we see there is an effort of the big players like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, to build their position along this full vertical stack of this industry. And my question to the panel is, we were now discussing those effects in consumer markets, that AI has some implications, how you can produce profitability, how you can steer end customers, how you can steer traffic, how you can exploit. And are there any feedback effects between this element of harm which may be happening in the consumer markets and the increasing concentration which we see along the vertical stack? Or do you have hope that actually this lively competition which we are seeing in the downstream markets will survive and will eventually eat also a little bit up the vertical supply chain? Any views on that?
I can try. About the vertical stack, something that we've been discussed a lot. That's a conversation that we should have. Okay, concentration in the AI industry and the vertical stack. It's an important one. The one question, so although economies of scale, network effects, data as being essential and scarce, and so on and so forth. I think we all understand that more competition among these providers is good. The one question that I'm trying to figure out is what is that concentration doing to the direction of innovation? Okay, which is something that you just mentioned. So the idea being, if you have more competition, is that going to lead this AI industry to create models that are better at extracting rents to the extent that they're supplying than companies? Think about, say, supplying Bing or supplying Meta with more sophisticated tools, or not. Okay. To some extent, I think, and I think Acemoglu is raising a similar point in a different context, which is that rent extraction is a problem. So sure, I mean, if there is concentration, these LLMs will be more expensive. And so there's going to be rents transferred from consumers and the industry upstream towards the cheap producers, and that's important. That's obviously important. But what's more important is that we get the right innovation. Okay? And I haven't seen a debate about that in this particular context of thinking about the vertical stack, which I think it's important. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that.
I think that's actually going in with something I was sort of focusing on, which was actually a few questions ago, this question about, we used to get this whole page of stuff and we might find what we wanted there, and now we get one answer. And the weird thing is that people prefer that. They don't want to have to do the extra work, and they go to ChatGPT even though search reliably gives them better answers, right? And so what freaks me out is that, well, first of all, with respect to how do we regulate that, when it came to democracy, when it came to the actual votes, they just banned it, right? So they just said, okay, we're going to not answer questions about who to vote for. And it's like, if you ban that, why don't you ban everything? I don't quite see what's going on there, that was the choice. So I feel like there's something that's not really being done here. Yeah, I think I'll drop it there. Yeah.
Moritz, you have a view on that?
Yeah, I guess the vertical stack question that you mentioned, and with eyes turning on NVIDIA, it does feel kind of silly now that we're discussing all these almost like niche platforms, by comparison to this juggernaut that NVIDIA has become. And is there already so much concentration on the hardware side that the software side sort of secondary? And I have hopes that some of the things we learn about platforms and the DMA and so on also applies to NVIDIA, because some of the ways in which NVIDIA's gatekeeping is not through the hardware, but through the software stack, and specifically CUDA and all the years of optimization that went into extremely NVIDIA-specific software that all deep learning libraries rely on. And that's sort of right now the reason why, for instance, we as an institute can't buy AMD, because we can buy the hardware. The hardware is not that bad. It's not that far behind. Our students would be like, what are we supposed to do with this? Like, this is a brick, right? As far as we're concerned, we don't know how to run anything on it, right? So it's worthless to us. And so that's the main reason why we have to buy NVIDIA stuff at a markup, because the software isn't there for the other hardware competitors. And so that then is maybe like a question to which some of these frameworks do apply. And but I would love to see some economists actually working this out. Like, what's sort of the perspective on NVIDIA?
Interesting. Oren? So I think we're also over the time. So I think it's to say thank you. Was a great discussion. So thanks to the panelists.